There are many scholars today who believe the most ancient biblical authors were polytheistic, and only later did monotheism slowly evolve out of this ancient setting. Then later editors rewrote their past and fabricated the idea that their ancestors were always monotheistic. However, the biblical text contains several anomalies that don't seem to fit with an evolution from polytheism, and fit far more with a sudden and ancient monotheistic revolution. One of the most difficult problems for scholars to uncover is, where did the divine name of Yahweh come from? It seems to have come out of the blue. It doesn't fit with early mythologies. Minder Dijkstra notes, "It is a puzzle that the name and character of Yahweh appears out of the blue in the ancient Near East, in contrast to deities such as El and Baal, and goddesses such as Asherah and Astarte. The name of Yahweh is still lacking in the list of gods, in myths, and other kinds of religious records of the ancient Near East before Iron 1. This is interesting as it relates to debate over two views on the origins of biblical monotheism. Some believe biblical monotheism must have evolved from an earlier polytheistic and henotheistic outlook. Yahweh was originally part of a pantheon that was later edited out of the Bible. So this would be evolutionary monotheism. However, there was another type of monotheism called revolutionary monotheism. Jan Osman says, whereas evolutionary monotheism may be seen as the final stage of polytheism, there is no evolutionary line leading from polytheism to revolutionary monotheism. This form of monotheism manifests itself in the first place as a negative or counter-religion, defining what God is not and how God should not be worshipped. This doesn't mean revolutionary monotheism is necessarily bringing about a brand new religion. It could also be a revival, like an attempt to return to the ancient beliefs of your ancestors, and still be revolutionary for the current time period it is taking place in. Revolutionary monotheism would be what we would expect if the biblical account is a true depiction of the past, where the high god, who is known as El Elyon, reveals himself by the name of Yahweh to individuals in different generations and calls for certain people to only worship and follow him. So the question we need to ask is, does the internal and limited external evidence favor evolutionary monotheism or revolutionary monotheism? The evidence seems to show there are too many anomalies that do not fit well with the evolutionary theory, and revolutionary monotheism fits far better with the data. To start, as we already noted, the name of Yahweh seems to appear suddenly and without signs of evolution. There are various theories of where the divine name came from, but the one that makes the most sense is it derives from the phrase in Exodus 3, "I will be that I will be." Trygve Medinger notes the name Yahweh fits well with the third-person form of this phrase, meaning to utter Yahweh means He is. Since no mortal human could say the divine phrase about himself, one refers to God in third person as Yahweh, or He is. Over time, I became convinced by Medinger's arguments over other alternative views. This seems to be the most sufficient origin to the name of Yahweh, given this is what is indicated in the text itself. The name Yahweh is understood as a form of the verb haya, to be. However, verbal form names for deities are exceptionally rare and seem to be unique to only Yahweh within Canaanite religions. Also, the name seems to imply a timeless nature and a special status that no other being could possibly possess, unlike how other deities from that time were viewed. This would make sense with the lack of a theogony in the biblical text for Yahweh, the birth story of a god's beginning. Whereas most other gods have a beginning point, the origins of Yahweh is absent from the text. So I would suggest the name Yahweh seems to fit better with a revolutionary model, not an evolution from a simpler deity in a pantheon. The name Yahweh, although predating Moses and the nation of Israel, shows no evidence it derives from typical Canaanite deity naming schemes or common Canaanite beliefs about deities. Now, the name is probably related to earlier Arabic languages and probably predates Moses. But the data on this is so limited and hard to nail down a definite connection. The best explanation is still the phrase in Exodus 3, that the name Yahweh is related to the phrase "I will be that I will be," and implies some sort of unique existence. There are also indications from external evidence. Israel was more focused on Yahweh in its earlier stages, and pagan worship was brought in as an addition to Israel's devotion to Yahweh. Marjo Korpel notes several odd silences from data outside of the Bible on early Israelite religion. Now, arguments from silence can be used with caution. If there was a good reason an author should have mentioned something and didn't, then an argument from silence may be used as a valid inference, and there are key pieces of data that should have included evidence of early polytheism. To start, in the early Mesha Stele, the king of Moab explicitly mentions the god and goddess of his own nation, but then in speaking about Israel, he only mentions their god Yahweh. If the goddess Asherah or any other god had a prominent role in early Israel, we should have expected to see them mentioned. Combined with that, Richard Hess knows most of the personal names in Israel from that time period are either El or Yahweh names, and there is very little evidence of people being named after other deities. In contrast to the nation of Ammon, we see what resembles more of a mix, with names referencing various deities. Dijkstra also notes the belief that Yahweh brought Israel up out of Egypt was believed to be an old tradition, and this tradition seems to lack the mention of other deities, which would make sense if Israel began with monotheistic ideas and pagan deities were only added in later. Benjamin Sommer draws attention to seals found throughout ancient Canaan. More than 8,500 stamp seals have been found in the region. Non-Israelite seals contain a wide variety of deities, whereas Israelite seals typically only portray one deity. Plus, they rarely provide a picture of the deity, and instead represent him symbolically as a sun disk. In fact, anthropomorphic representation of deities became vastly less common in the highlands of ancient Israel. Each of these points individually wouldn't amount to much, but combined, it seems to favor the idea Israel originally was more monotheistic and paganism was synchronized in later, instead of Israel originally being polytheistic and evolving to monotheism. Now, once again, as we said in our last video, there is no doubt there was rampant polytheism in Israel during this time period. J.S. Holliday found that in certain villages, about 45% of all households had some type of cultic idol. But this is still less than half, and would make more sense if polytheism was attempting to infiltrate Israel instead of it being there originally. The cultic images began at a local level, which the Bible talks about, whereas the official religion of Israel was still devotion to Yahweh. We should expect far more incorporated and rampant polytheism if it was there originally. Thus, this data not only matches the biblical account, but seems to fit far better with early revolutionary monotheism. The biblical authors also did things that wouldn't have made sense if they were originally polytheistic. Polytheists in Egypt, Greece, Rome, Babylon, Assyria tended to synchronize their deities with those of other cultures. When Assyrian beliefs mixed with Babylonian beliefs, their god Ashur was equated with Marduk. If the biblical authors were originally polytheistic, it would make sense for them to do the same thing with Yahweh. But instead, they proclaim Yahweh as Lord over all the nations and above all gods, while living under Babylonian rule. This was quite a dangerous thing to do for a conquered nation, and it would look rather foolish to the surrounding cultures. Why not just go with the cultural norm and say Yahweh was Marduk, if they were originally more polytheistic? But it does fit if they already viewed themselves as monolatrists, with implicit monotheism, and had an ancient covenant with a unique God who was already seen as the Most High. Christine Hayes notes the anomaly of Israelite monotheism arising, as it doesn't seem to fit with the cultural world of that day.
Conquest and exile were events that normally would spell the end of a particular ethnic national group, particularly in antiquity. Conquered peoples would trade their defeated god for the victorious god of their conquerors, and eventually there would be cultural and religious assimilation, intermarriage, that people would disappear as a distinctive entity. And in fact, that is what happened to the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom to a large degree. They were lost to history. But this did not happen to those members of the nation of Israel who lived in the southern kingdom, Judah. Despite the demise of their national political base in 586, the Israelites alone, really, among the many peoples who have figured in ancient Near Eastern history, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Phoenicians, the Hurrians, the Canaanites, they emerged after the death of their state, producing a community and a culture that can be traced through various twists and turns and vicissitudes of history right down into the modern period. That's a pretty unique claim. And they carried with them the idea and the traditions that laid the foundation for the major religions of the Western world: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Next, much to our surprise, there is no Hebrew word for a female deity. Yehezkel Kaufman once said, "The Hebrew of the Bible possesses no word to designate a feminine deity. It has no Elah, Eliah, or Eloha." I thought this had to be false when I first read it, but nevertheless it turns out to be true. The ancient Hebraic language contains no words for a generic female deity. And there are places they could have used the word when referencing Asherah, and there was a word for goddess in Ugaritic texts, one of Israel's closest cultural parallels. However, the lack of the word would make sense if the original Hebraic writings lacked a pantheon that was only added in later through rebellion. If you only had one genderless deity, there is no need for such a word. If monotheism evolved from polytheism, there should have been a remnant word that could indicate a female goddess. Yet this cannot be demonstrated within the Hebrew scriptures. We need to remember languages tend to be more conservative than the culture, as Roland Devaux says. Language is more conservative than custom, and Hebrew retains several traces of that semi-nomadic life of years gone by. For example, generations after the conquest, a house was called a tent, and not only in poetry, where it is frequent, but also in everyday speech. Disbanded soldiers return every man to his own tent. Again, to express leaving early in the morning, a verb is often used which means to load the beasts of burden. Nomads use the word to say striking camp at dawn. So the lack of a word for goddess doesn't seem to fit with evolutionary monotheism, but fits far more with the biblical account of Israel, starting out as monotheistic and then becoming more polytheistic once they settled in Canaan and began to mix with the surrounding pagan cultures. On top of this, Edward Sermon has argued pastoral and nomadic cultures from Africa and America lean more towards monotheism, as it is more pragmatic. Multiple gods require a culture that is settled down in cities, so more attention can be paid to the gods. It is much harder to attend to holy tents or mobile shrines of multiple gods when you have to keep moving things around. More primitive and nomadic cultures in Africa, like the Maasai or Kikuyu, are far more monotheistic in their approach. Likewise, given Israel was originally nomadic according to its own origins, it makes more sense for monotheism to have been there originally and later degrade into polytheism when they settled in Canaan. Also, unlike the surrounding pagan nations, Yahweh is not imminently manifested in nature. In Egypt, the sun was the manifestation of a god, as other elements of nature were as well. But this doesn't seem to be the case in the Hebrew Bible. H.C. Bridgetoe says, biblical religion not only removes the one God from the domain of mythology, but as often noted, it demythologizes creation itself. And this is even wild echoes with the constructs of pagan mythology. Trygve Medinger says, in the Old Testament, God's proximity to the world is never such that one could speak of his immanence in the narrow sense. God does not dwell in the sun, the stars, the rain, or the wind, not even passages that expressly speak of God dwelling in the temple on Zion describe an unsophisticated or undifferentiated concept of immanence. On the contrary, the Old Testament emphasizes God's exaltation above worldly matters, transcendence. For the biblical authors, nature was impersonal. There is only one God above all who controls everything, but he is not manifested in nature, unlike what the surrounding polytheistic nations believed about their gods. At times, biblical authors used analogies or metaphors to praise God, but they never explicitly describe him as nature or a part of nature. So, as Mark Chavalas says, for Israel, Yahweh was the end-all to reality. It stemmed from him as a transcendent being. In Mesopotamia, as in Canaan, there was a multiplicity of powers, all stemming from and dependent upon an external reality. Also, despite the way it appears on the surface, God is displayed as beyond genders in the biblical texts. Menninger notes Yahweh is described oftentimes in feminine ways, as caring for a suckling child, having a womb, crying like a woman in labor, having birth pains, being the proper replacement for female deities, and woman is also his image. When God is described as Father, the text implies that is more about the role Yahweh plays than ascribing gender, as is when God is described in feminine ways. Thus, Menninger concludes Yahweh was unique among other deities as being genderless. The logical implication of this would seem to be that Yahweh was conceived as standing above genders of the created world, that is, that God was held to be asexual. Next, pagan deities needed to be cared for. Within polytheistic religions, humans depended on the gods, and the gods depended on humans. Humans would feed and care for the gods, and the gods would protect humans. Jean Bottero records how the gods were provided meals throughout the day and given perfumes and special gifts, and in return, the gods would keep order, provide protection, and return favors. And this would have made paganism more attractive. If you can buy a god with gifts containing something they need, you can trade that for selfish rewards, which would explain why Israel was eager to worship them. But the biblical religion is clear that God needs nothing of humans, which is why you can't buy Yahweh off, and this can make the biblical religion less appealing to the ancient mind. What was more valuable than a God you could trade with? Moving away from a mutual relationship within polytheism doesn't seem pragmatic if you want your religion to compete and survive. Why make Yahweh inaccessible on your level when that wasn't the cultural norm? It's also clear, as Yehezkel Kaufman pointed out, that Yahweh lacked a mythology on how he became the supreme deity. Surrounding cultures typically had a story of how their high deity took control of the pantheon and became the head god. Great examples are Marduk, Baal, and Zeus. Benjamin Sommer notes this often came about after a great battle with other deities. However, this is oddly lacking in the biblical texts. In places like Psalm 29 and Isaiah 6, other lesser divine beings exist only to praise God, not to battle him or elect him to the position. In Genesis 1:26, the divine council is only informed and not consulted when electing man as the image of God. There are some texts that do refer to Yahweh battling against his enemies, similar to how other pagan deities battled so they could ascend to be the Most High. But Sommer says, the biblical texts differ from the Ugaritic parallels, however in crucial respects. They describe a doomed revolt against a deity who was already in charge, a revolt Yahweh puts down without any difficulty. These passages lack any real drama, for they convey no sense that Yahweh was required to engage in real exertion to suppress the insurrection. Baal and Marduk, Zeus and Cronus toiled to attain an exalted status. Yahweh had that status to begin with and retains it with ease. In other words, Yahweh is just assumed to be all-powerful, There is no story on how he ascended to be the Most High, no story of how he came into existence, and the world never exists without him. He is simply unique as is, and never seems to change from one state to a more exalted state. Also, Israel's God is distinct in being a jealous God over worship of other gods. John Walton says, "The gods would not be jealous of attention paid to other gods as long as their needs were being met and their position was not in jeopardy." Again, in this way, the God of Israel was very different from any other deity, and the Israelites had quite a bit of trouble adjusting their thinking to the idea that Yahweh would not tolerate the open-ended system. In the ancient world, you could typically affirm allegiance to a god, but then also worship other gods, especially if they covered a different realm of inquiry. The concept of a god being jealous over loyalty or worship is pretty rare. Now, as we noted in the last video, there were monolatrous tendencies within other cultures, but the idea of these other gods being jealous was not inherent in their reasons to become monolatrist. Yahweh seems to be distinct in jealousy over people worshipping other gods. Medinger says, Yahweh's violent jealousy, which tolerates no rival, is without parallel in the religious literature of the ancient Near East. Another peculiar distinction is how ethics changed in the biblical worldview. We find no evidence in polytheistic cultures they considered their gods to be the foundation of morality, or faithful, or loving towards humanity. They may have displayed these characteristics at times, but they were not essential or immutable qualities. The character of the gods could change randomly, much in the same way people can change. Whereas Yahweh was seen as eternally good, thereby making it impossible for him to do evil or be unjust. But the idea of morality was also different in the biblical worldview. First, various texts in the ancient world speak of people wishing they could decipher the will of the gods. For example, I wish I knew that these things were pleasing to one's God. What is proper to oneself is an offense to one's God. What in one's own heart seems despicable is proper to one's God. Who knows the will of the gods in heaven? Who understands the plans of the underworld gods? Where have mortals learnt the way of God? Jean Patero cites another interesting text. O gods Ea, Shamash, and Marduk, what sins have I committed, for such a curse, such misfortune to have befallen? My God, your punishment is a heavy burden, and yet I know not the reason. What must I have done, O God, and what must I have committed? To find myself like river water, flowing I know not where, like a boat, not knowing where I will land. Understanding what the gods wanted was a difficult task that could rarely be known, as it could change on a whim. Patero even notes there is no lack of names that meant, what sin have I committed, or what have I done against my God? However, Yahweh's will was made clear in expressing a good moral character and devotion to him above all else. Thus in Israel, the obligations of God were made known and were not built on the whims of a deity who could change their laws when their emotions changed. In the polytheistic cultures, such ideas were not known, and the will of the gods was random and distant. J.J. Finkelstein and Jean Patero have argued the biblical idea of morality was revolutionary to how the ancient world viewed right and wrong. Since the laws of the Torah introduced personal guilt, integrity, and located morality in the character of God himself. Right and wrong was not a new idea in the ancient world, but right and wrong was redirected in the Pentateuch. Order was the highest good, and disorder was the worst of evils in the ancient world. So for the ancient mindset, it was more sinful for a prostitute to leave her temple and find a better life than just remain a prostitute, because such an act would break the order and her placement in society. This idea is turned on its head in the Pentateuch. Prostitution is immoral as an act in and of itself, and it is better to break the order of things than to do something immoral. So as Carol Vandertorn says, the Babylonians did not have an introspective tradition and had little sense of interiority. subjectivity had not been invented yet. The virtual absence of interiority and subjectivity in the Babylonian autobiographical tradition follows from the concept of a person as a social role and character. Individual identity, in this view, is not what you are deep down, but what you manifest to be. It is public and social. Jean Patero says, "Did morality, honest and righteous behavior, have an authentic religious and cultural value, a place in the practice of religion, a direct influence on the gods? We have never found any response in all of our documentation to such a question that we ask ourselves from our own religious and biblical point of view. The ancient Mesopotamians never overtly concerned themselves with or imagined such preoccupations, which are so familiar to us. This must have been one of Moses' great revolutions in Israel, to replace the purely material maintenance of the gods with the single and sole liturgical obligation in life to obey a moral law, thereby truly rendering to God the only homage worthy of him." Thus the Torah radically changed the way right and wrong were viewed by introducing moral laws as primary, not keeping and establishing order in society, regardless of how it affected the individual. With this, the idea of personal guilt and integrity came in. Van der Toorn notes, because of how the ancient world viewed morality, their focus was on honor and shame. You did good to receive public honor, and you did not do what was bad, so you did not receive public shame. Thus, good and evil were public ideas, not personal ideas. So if you committed adultery, and neither you or the participant told anyone, there was no sin committed, since it brought no public shame. But in the Torah, something is still wrong even if no one sees it, or it doesn't affect the community. Sin is thus moved to a personal level between you and God, not between you and the community. John Walton says, "The knowledge of the Torah created a far different situation concerning their awareness of offense and the ability to confess it. The ability to identify offense and the sense of having done wrong provide a fertile environment for guilt to emerge at a different level." Christine Hayes notes the phrase that appears frequently in the Pentateuch, "I am the Lord your God," was placed there on purpose to teach integrity, as it is often paired with moral commands. The idea was God was always watching, so you ought to do good regardless if anyone sees, because you are beholden to God first.
The scope of the law is holistic. It's going to contain social and ethical and moral and religious prescriptions, and very often they're going to be couched in an authoritative apodictic style, particularly the things that aren't enforceable in a court of law. They will tend to be the ones that are backed up by the authority of God directly. "You shall do this, I, the Lord, am your God." Notice how many times that refrain is used, and it's almost always used with those unenforceable kinds of things. Love your neighbor as yourself. I, the Lord, am your God. It's me who's watching out for this one, not the court. Okay?
Thus the Pentateuch radically changed how ancient people viewed morality, and this would also explain why many Israelites preferred to worship other gods instead. They were not omniscient, so they couldn't see everything, and they didn't advocate morality in a biblical sense, thus making it easier to do as one pleased. The biblical view breaks from this worldview, and it would seem odd to have developed out of such polytheistic cultures with their way of thinking. Another odd feature is where the biblical religion of Yahweh claims that it came from. The Bible claims it began as a family religion of Abraham, and over time became a tribal religion and then a national religion of Israel. This seems to be the only known example of this type of development. State gods did become family gods or specific tribal gods, but we don't see other examples of a god only associated with a family becoming a national god. Yahweh is distinct in this. And this is an odd origin story. If you want to claim your nation had a right to the land in Canaan, why invent a story that your forefather was a foreigner with an unheard of name of the Most High God El Elyon? This would be like a group of Hindus claiming Krishna gave them Texas, but it was okay because they identified Krishna with Jesus. This is not the best way to go about claiming the land was yours over the people who had already lived there before Abraham. On top of this, the Pentateuch obligates one to worship the state god and the state god only. Other nations had state gods, but people were not obligated to worship such a deity and only that deity. The common people could worship the state god and their ancestral deities, or any deities for that matter. This is why it could appear that Israel was committed to Yahweh alone, but the people believed they could worship other gods as they pleased. They were perceived as still devoted to Yahweh and being an Israelite, but could still consult other deities for other matters. Jeroboam I could credit his victory in obtaining the northern kingdom of Israel to Yahweh and still worship other deities for other matters after the fact. The ancient mindset didn't consider this to be a contradiction. But the biblical writers were distinct from the surrounding nations in demanding they only could be devoted to Yahweh and only worship Him. And they based this on their ancient covenant they claimed they had, thus setting themselves up as a unique people among the other nations. Of course, the use of the Sabbath also fits better with the revolutionary theory, as there is nothing like it in the ancient Near East. The Sabbath was the sign of the Mosaic covenant. It was to be performed publicly to show one was in covenant with Yahweh, and there is no evidence of this practice evolving from an earlier precursor. So the Sabbath fits better with a revolutionary covenant introduced early in Israel's history. Next, we cannot forget the explicit commandment of no graven images. This is not the outlawing of basic iconography or art. A graven image was how a deity manifested its presence in the material realm, so humans could care for him, and it was how humans gained access to the presence of a deity. In Egypt, court cases were brought before Amun, where he would give answers as manipulated by the priests. In other words, humans could care for the needs of the gods, and the gods would grant rewards or access to them in return. The biblical worldview rejects that the presence of Yahweh can be contained to such an image or controlled by humans. God was not obligated to manifest in a graven image and provide answers when humans demanded it. Trygve Medinger notes, this differs radically from the surrounding peoples. And this idea would make sense with revolutionary monotheism, but would seem an odd way to evolve if the evolutionary theory is true. Now, here's the main issue. You could say later biblical authors scrubbed the text clean of any mention of these things we went over, which is possible, but improbable given the amount of things they would have had to remove or change and not leave any resemblance behind. It seems far more likely from internal evidence and the very limited external evidence we have available that the biblical religion represents revolutionary monotheism and struggles to fit with the idea of evolutionary monotheism. So it's more similar to Akhenaten's revolutionary monotheism. Akhenaten's monotheism is an example of a revolution that was attempted but failed. The biblical religion should be understood as a revolution that was fought against but ultimately prevailed. This seems to make far more sense with the data. And so, as Alan Millard notes, a unique phenomenon is awkward for historians, since they have no standard way to explain or assess it. So they make strenuous attempts to fit it with a pattern of known features in the same general category. In other words, attempts are made to try and force the biblical religion into an evolutionary mold. But this is simply strenuous and should be rejected. Now, before we wrap up, we are not denying the obvious fact that Israel was still an ancient Near Eastern culture. They were not completely independent from the surrounding cultures, and we can find obvious parallels within the biblical text to surrounding practices and beliefs. But even though Israel was a part of the ancient world, they were also unique within the ancient world. There was something different about the biblical worldview that stood out and managed to stand the test of time, that cannot be explained by simply stating this evolved from a polytheistic background. The biblical religion is best explained as a revolutionary idea that was working within the ancient Near Eastern mindset, which is why there are similarities, but the differences cannot be ignored. It makes far more sense with the theory a new idea was introduced into the ancient world, suddenly and revolutionary in its thinking. The Bible is an ancient canon of monotheistic documents. Or is it? Many scholars believe that what we have today is the product of later editing and changes. Originally, the most ancient biblical authors were polytheistic, and later strict monotheists redacted and changed the oldest documents to sound more monotheistic. Is this true? Is biblical history a later product of monotheists hiding a polytheistic past? Despite the Bible as we have it today being a clear monotheistic canon, many scholars believe it is the work of scribes who wanted to hide a polytheistic past in Israel and pretend their history was a relationship with just one God and their ancestors. An argument to support this view that is often made is from the archaeological finds. We don't find a lot of evidence of strict monotheism in ancient Israel or in the surrounding nations. Instead, what we find is evidence of rampant polytheism, and Yahweh possibly being incorporated into a pantheon and given a goddess as a wife. If all we had was the archaeological record, we would have very little evidence to suggest monotheism existed in ancient Canaan. However, we need to remember what we're asking here. The question is not if Israel was polytheistic. The question is whether or not the biblical authors and certain ancestors were originally polytheistic. If the Bible is true and accurate in its representation of the past, we should expect to find rampant polytheism throughout ancient Israel, because that is what the biblical authors report happened from generation to generation. The book of Joshua says Abraham originally worshipped other gods, and when Israel lived in Egypt, they worshipped other gods. While they were wandering, they may have been devoted to Yahweh in name, but even then they chased after other gods. After Joshua died, the book of Judges recounts that over several generations, the Israelites worshipped false gods. Solomon may have constructed the temple, but within his own lifetime, he polluted Israel with idols. Throughout the time of the divided monarchy, any resemblance of strict devotion to Yahweh would be expected to be missing, with the exception of a few kings. The book of 1 Kings even says that at one time, there was only about 7,000 left in Israel who only worshipped Yahweh. The biblical account does align with the archaeological record, as they report the problem of rampant polytheism from generation to generation. So if we ever excavate the Temple Mount thoroughly and find evidence of polytheism, that would be expected if biblical history is true. The real question is, does the biblical account accurately report the story of a small cult that preached devotion to only one God, that only managed to get power and influence at random times in Israel's history? Because that is the biblical account. Not the idea there was this faithful nation that always hated pagan idol worship and never abandoned the covenant with their God. That history doesn't exist anywhere, as Michael Heiser says. There was a good deal of theological diversity, including polytheism, among Israelites living hither and yon in the deserts, hill country, coastal plains, etc., but not with respect to the biblical writers. So we really should not be asking if Israel was always strictly monotheistic, but if the biblical authors were, and if they accurately represented the past of there being ancient monotheistic tendencies in Israel, who handed down their teachings to us. But when it comes to the biblical texts, many scholars still ask if the theological views of early authors were changed by later authors. So first, we need to define what we mean by monotheism, because this is a fairly new term. No one in the ancient world called themselves a monotheist or a polytheist. And what we mean by monotheist may not be what the ancient authors meant. The colloquial understanding of the word monotheism is the belief there is only one God. But when we start to look for cultures or writers who fit into this mold, we realize there is a great amount of diversity. For example, Jens Andre Herbener notes there are several types of monotheism. There is philosophical monotheism, which is the theology of a small elite, usually tolerant of the people's worship of many gods. It is characterized by the notion of a supreme god, of whom all the other gods are merely aspects. There is inclusive monotheism, implying that a divine unity is hidden behind a diversity of gods. There is ethical monotheism, which is supposed to be a characteristic of the biblical Jewish concept of the divine, and which is particularly characterized by the notion that God is just and by requiring a moral way of life. Jan Osman notes there is evolutionary monotheism and there is revolutionary monotheism. This form of monotheism manifests itself in the first place as a negative or counter-religion, defining what God is not and how God should not be worshipped. And on top of this, there are many other forms of monotheism. So to keep things simple for the sake of this video, we'll use Herbener's definition of monotheism, which is the belief in one true God and the implicit or explicit exclusion of other gods as non-existent, demons, or the like. In other words, the use of the category of monotheism should be restricted to religions and elements of religions characterized by a belief in the existence of solely one God. Now notice this broad definition doesn't exclude the existence of other spiritual beings that could be considered gods or divine beings by other cultures. It doesn't exclude the idea of showing reverence to other spiritual beings as well. This is important to remember going forward. Next, another problem is that when we look at the biblical texts and other ancient texts, there is really no equivalent word in Hebrew for God. What we translate as God is the word Elohim, and that seems to have a broader definition than what our English word God means. Michael Heiser points out the term Elohim refers to Yahweh, but it is also used to refer to divine beings on God's heavenly council, the gods of other nations, demons, the spirit of dead Samuel, and the figure known as the angel of Yahweh. Now, no one denies there was ancestral cult worship in Israel, and even the biblical authors suggest this. But there is no evidence the biblical authors thought the dead spirit of Samuel was a god, or a being one should worship. The same is clear for demons or foreign gods. The biblical authors suggest these are real spiritual entities, but that doesn't mean one should worship them or that they are the true God, as we define this English word. Also, many times in the biblical texts, there are references to a divine council and its members. It was a common belief in the ancient Near East to think of the gods in the heavens on a divine council presiding over the cosmos. And the biblical authors were no different in their belief and make references to a heavenly council. However, the difference is, for the biblical authors, they did not teach that power and knowledge was shared among different members, like in polytheistic councils. The implication in the biblical text is Yahweh is sovereign over all, and the council members are just there to carry out God's will and assist however they can. So for the biblical authors, divine council members could be Elohim, but they should not be worshipped like Yahweh. So it seems in the Bible, the word Elohim just meant any being that lived in the spiritual realm. Yahweh was an Elohim, but not all Elohim were Yahweh, or equal to him. In reality, the divine name is the closest thing we have that best fits what modern people say when they hear the English word God. Because Elohim seems to refer to just a spiritual being, a demon, an angel, a dead person, or something else. Technically speaking, there is really no ancient generic word to distinguish between the creator God and what we refer to as demons or angels. Ancient cultures lumped all these beings together under one or two terms. Samuel Meyer notes, supernatural messengers in the ancient Near Eastern cultures typically are identified by the lexical item in that language also used to identify human messengers or subordinates sent on missions. There is therefore no specially reserved term to distinguish a class of such gods from other gods on the one hand, and from human messengers on the other. So when we say there is only one God, an ancient Yahwist might agree if we explain what we mean by the term God. We mean there is only one eternal, omnipotent creator. Yet, we might agree with the ancient Yahwist that there are multiple Elohim, once we understand what they mean by that term. So like polytheism, monotheism can posit multiple divine beings, and can even allow someone to display reverence to multiple spiritual beings. But monotheists also say that people should only worship one of these divine beings, specifically the Creator. Michael Fried, in his study of ancient Greek religions, notes that there are too many ambiguities between polytheism and monotheism. Both typically posit a high creator God and lesser divine beings that were created and exist in the spiritual realm. A monotheist, like a strict Catholic, could venerate and ask for intercessory prayer from another spiritual being. But that doesn't mean they are actually polytheistic, because they only worship the one creator God. But that sounds like another view that is contrasted here, called monolatry, which is defined to mean the acknowledgement of other gods, or spiritual beings, but the exclusive worship of only one God. A lighter form of this is called henotheism, which typically means the temporary elevation of one deity as the only God one should worship within a polytheistic setting. So now, if we understand the Bible acknowledges there are other Elohim, just created spiritual beings that can be real entities behind these foreign idols, then the biblical authors seem to be more about preaching monolatry theologically, while thinking of monotheism in ontological terms. In other words, because the word Elohim doesn't equate perfectly with our English word for God, we can see where the confusion comes in. Theologically, the Bible preaches monolatry. Only worship one Elohim, who is Yahweh. But in their theological statements, there is implicit monotheism, as we understand it, that there is only one eternal creator, even though there are other divine beings that were worshipped by other people. So in reality, when we think of what the biblical authors are claiming, it is better understood in terms of monolatry, since we have to use their words and definitions, especially when it comes to the term Elohim. Sure, we could say they are monotheists, but in reality, they were more focused on preaching monolatry. So from this point on, when I refer to biblical monotheism, I mean theological monolatry with implicit ontological monotheism. So please try to keep that in mind. Now some object to this, because there are times we read phrases like, "There are no gods beside me, neither shall there be after me." These statements have been used to argue for an evolution to monotheism, since at some places in the biblical text it refers to multiple Elohim. But these other passages might imply there are no other Elohim. Well, in reality, these verses fit well with the idea of there being multiple Elohim, just not equal to Yahweh. First, the use of multiple Elohim on the divine council doesn't go away when monotheism was supposed to emerge. It is still present in Jewish works that are considered by most scholars to be late. Also, Michael Heiser has gone through the Dead Sea Scrolls and has found numerous references to divine council theology. The Hebrew term for assembly and council appear unambiguously in references to a heavenly assembly. The phrase for divine assembly occurs 6 times. Between the main phrase and the variations, there are 7 instances of assembly of the Elohim. Council of the Elohim occurs 3 times. The phrase all the Elohim is found 18 times, and the host of the Elohim occurs twice. Heiser says, by way of summary, there are nearly 180 instances of explicit divine plurality in the sectarian Qumran scrolls, a number far greater than in the Hebrew Bible. Many of these instances are found in unequivocal divine council contexts of the type associated with the allegedly polytheistic stage of the religion of biblical Israel. These gods are found in the heavenly temple heights, praising God and serving Him. Angels are seldom found in these contexts. The data therefore portray a theological situation quite contrary to what would be expected if Jewish theological thinking was moving away from polytheistic belief towards an intolerant monotheism. No one doubts the Essenes, the sect that gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls, were monotheistic. If there was an evolution away from polytheism, why are the phrases of multiple Elohim still in use in this very late material? Perhaps the late and early material both understand divine council references doesn't imply polytheism. Now, Mark Smith is aware of this fact, and argues that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the fully fledged deities were reduced to mere heavenly powers by this point in time. But I fail to see an explicit indication of this. The language in the early and late material is similar enough to posit the theology could have been the same in the older periods. It makes more sense to say biblical authors believed in the existence of multiple Elohim, but Yahweh was sovereign and above all other Elohim, just like modern Christians believe when it comes to God and his angels. Even Mark Smith has to acknowledge references to a divine council doesn't mean the writer is necessarily polytheistic. Next, statements where we read there are no Elohim beside me also fit with divine council theology and the existence of multiple Elohim. These verses were not an attempt to hide ancient polytheism, and one doesn't need to look far for an analogy. In Isaiah 47, we read that Babylon proclaims, "There is no one besides me." This can hardly be understood as a claim that there were no other cities. The phrase only indicates that Babylon is declaring itself to lack an equal, and that no city is as great as it. Likewise, when Yahweh says there are no Elohim beside him, it only indicates his uniqueness with regards to other Elohim. There is no one as great and as powerful as he. Given the immediate context of the Hebrew Bible, these verses can hardly be attempts to claim there were no other Elohim, just that no other Elohim was like that of Yahweh.
The average Christian would firmly deny the existence of deities other than the God of the Bible. While lesser spiritual entities such as angels and demons are real, figures from long-dead religions like Zeus, Thor, and Ra, or the pantheons of modern religions like Hinduism, simply do not exist. They are imaginary. But as we will see, this view is too simplistic to capture what the Bible really communicates about the inhabitants of the divine realm. It may surprise many Christians to learn that God is often directly compared to other deities in Scripture. For you, Lord, are the most high over all the earth. You are exalted far above all gods. Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you, in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way. These are only a handful of passages that praise Yahweh by showing his superiority to other gods. The question Christians must wrestle with is, how do statements like this make sense if these other gods do not really exist? Think of how it would sound if someone tried to exalt Jesus by comparing him to an imaginary creature. It would not only be offensive to say, Jesus is better than a leprechaun, it would be illogical. The same is true for the comparisons between God and other deities in the Old Testament. The ancient authors are not comparing God to imaginary beings. In order for these exaltations to be logical and non-blasphemous to ancient Israelites, the gods which Yahweh is compared to must be real. What about passages which seemingly deny the existence of other gods? Isn't this proof that other gods are simply fictional? I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me there is no God. Wherefore thou art great, O Lord God, for there is none like thee, neither is there any God beside thee, according to all that we have heard with our ears. You were shown these things, so that you might know that the Lord is God. Besides him there is no other. If these passages are taken literally, there is a contradiction between them and the exaltations mentioned earlier. But there need be no contradiction. if one accepts that the authors are describing the incomparability of the God of Israel, not claiming the other gods aren't real. Saying there is no God other than the God of Israel is akin to someone from Green Bay boasting that there is no football team other than the Packers. This becomes very clear when statements of incomparability are applied to things other than God. The 47th chapter of Isaiah is a judgment against Babylon. In verse 8, the author puts words in the condemned city's mouth. Now therefore hear this, you lover of pleasures, who sit securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children. The same thing happens with the city of Nineveh in the book of Zephaniah. This is the city of revelry that lived in safety. She said to herself, I am the one, and there is none besides me. Obviously, Babylon and Nineveh were not the only cities on earth. Like passages which say there is no other God, these are not statements of denial. They are boasts of incomparability. One of the most well-known stories from the Bible is the Israelites' escape from Egypt. While it is easy to view this story as a confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh, the real conflict is between Yahweh and the Egyptian pantheon. On the eve of the first Passover, before the final plague, God himself declares, On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. This statement, which comes from God's own mouth, makes no sense if the gods of Egypt were not real. It dishonors God to think he would boast about passing judgment on imaginary beings. What about idols? If other gods are real, then why does the Bible claim the statues used by pagans are nothing more than inanimate physical objects? And there you shall serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. One must understand that ancient people made a distinction between the physical idols and the spirits which dwelt inside them. As I explained in my book, The Unseen Realm, ancient idol worshippers believed the objects they made were inhabited by gods. This is why they performed ceremonies to open the mouth of the statue. The mouth had to be ritually opened so the spirit of the deity could move in. This process localized the god to a specific geographic area. While the authors of the Bible poked fun at the statues idolaters used, they did not deny the existence of the spirits inside the idols. We can see this distinction at work in 1 Corinthians. Do I mean then that food sacrificed to an idol is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, but the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God, and I do not want you to be participants with demons. Paul is saying that the sacrifice and the idol are inconsequential, but the demon linked to the idol is not something Christians should be associated with. Paul is quoting the Old Testament here. In Deuteronomy 32:17, Moses accused the Israelites of worshiping demons who were not God, gods they had never known. Many Christians are willing to acknowledge the existence of other spiritual entities apart from Yahweh, but they are not comfortable using the English word God with a lowercase g to describe them. They would prefer to call these other entities demons. While this isn't precisely correct, whatever term we use, it is clear the Bible describes real spiritual entities who have power on earth and accept the worship of humans. To the authors of the Bible, these gods were not imaginary. So, does this mean the Bible is polytheistic? Not in any way. The Bible is very consistent in the way it exalts the God of Israel over other deities. While other spiritual players exist, Yahweh is never said to be equal to them. Yahweh does not want or need an idol to inhabit. He cannot be captured and localized through ritual. Only Yahweh is described in the Bible as all-powerful, all-knowing, and self-existent. According to the Bible, only Yahweh, the God of Israel, is worthy of worship. And only Yahweh is the creator of all things in heaven and earth, the spiritual and terrestrial realms. The Bible never says these things about other gods. What we see in the Bible is a hierarchy of spiritual beings with God at the top. This hierarchy is much more complicated than simple ideas about angels and demons. Psalm 82, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, is said to hold judgment over other gods. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Psalm 82 becomes very interesting if you learn a little Hebrew. The word most often translated God or gods in the Old Testament is Elohim. Watch what happens when we reveal where that word is used in this passage. Notice that both the capital G, God, and the lowercase g, gods, were changed. That is because the word Elohim can be used for several different things. The context of the passage tells us what Elohim is referring to. The Bible's writers use Elohim as an alternate name for Yahweh over 1,000 times, but Elohim can also refer to the gods of foreign nations, or demons, spirits of the human dead, and angels, most likely the angel of the Lord. As you can see, these are all inhabitants of the spiritual realm. It should be clear from this list that not all Elohim were considered equal. While Yahweh is an Elohim, the writers of the Bible considered him unique and far above the others. The ancient Israelites thought of the spiritual world as a three-tiered hierarchy with God at the top. It may surprise many Christians to learn that angels are actually on the lowest tier of the hierarchy. The Hebrew word for angel, malach, is basically a job description used to denote a spirit being who carries out modest tasks, like delivering messages. The tier above the angels is occupied by beings called B'nai Elohim in Hebrew. B'nai Elohim is usually translated sons of God in English Bibles, and when most people read that phrase, they are not even aware it refers to spiritual beings. But as we will see, the sons of God played an important role in the Old Testament. In the beginning of the book of Job, there is a meeting of God's court or council. Guess who is there? Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, a term that means adversary, also came among them. The sons of God do not only show up in God's throne room. Later, in Job, we see that the sons of God were present at creation. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding, who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. We can see that the sons of God were important figures. In the Old Testament, they are often associated with God's inner circle. That inner circle has a name. Scholars call it the Divine Council, which comes from Psalm 82, verse 1. It is the collection of spiritual beings through which God chooses to administer his rule. All ancient Mediterranean religions had some concept of a divine council, and the Israelites were no different. In the 22nd chapter of 1 Kings, the prophet Micaiah describes a meeting of the divine council. In this scene, God decides that Ahab needs to be dealt with. And Micaiah said, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another." Notice that God does not deal with Ahab directly. He lets his council decide who should go. After much deliberation, God deems one of the council members worthy. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, "I will entice him." And the Lord said to him, "By what means?" And he said, "I will go out, and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And he said, "You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so." God then commands the spirit to carry out the plan and foretells its success. Scenes like this from God's throne room are very interesting, but probably the most illuminating passage about the divine council and the sons of God is the passage we started with. In Psalm 82, we learn that some of the council members are under judgment because they have acted wickedly. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, You are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die, and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. As we can see, the gods under judgment in this passage are not just any Elohim. They are the B'nai Elyon, the sons of the Most High, or the sons of God in other passages, members of Yahweh's inner circle. If this is the first time you've really taken a close look at Psalm 82, you probably have 100 questions. But it is impossible to touch on every subject concerning the ancient Israelites' view of the spiritual realm in a short video like this. In-depth information on these topics can be found in my book, The Unseen Realm. Or you can visit one of my websites, drmsh.com or thedivinecouncil.com. Or you can watch my Divine Council 101 video series on YouTube.
Even Mark Smith has to acknowledge references to a divine council doesn't mean the writer is necessarily polytheistic. Next, statements where we read there are no Elohim beside me also fit with divine council theology and the existence of multiple Elohim. These verses were not an attempt to hide ancient polytheism, and one doesn't need to look far for an analogy. In Isaiah 47, we read that Babylon proclaims, "There is no one besides me." This can hardly be understood as a claim that there were no other cities. The phrase only indicates that Babylon is declaring itself to lack an equal, and that no city is as great as it. Likewise, when Yahweh says there are no Elohim beside him, it only indicates his uniqueness with regards to other Elohim. There is no one as great and as powerful as he. Given the immediate context of the Hebrew Bible, these verses can hardly be attempts to claim there were no other Elohim, just that no other Elohim was like that of Yahweh. Now, Mark Smith mentions several verses that could indicate polytheism, but most of them never indicate there was another Elohim equal to Yahweh, or that Yahweh was beneath another Elohim. They can all be understood in terms of monotheistic divine council theology, like what we've already gone over. There are, however, two passages that some scholars rely heavily on to indicate ancient polytheism is hidden in the Bible. First, let's take a second to recognize the gravity of this. In the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, there are only two passages that are primarily used that could indicate ancient polytheism. This should raise at least the thought this could just be quote mining and circular reasoning. Honestly, if the best I can do is rely mainly on two passages, I have to admit that's not very impressive. The first passage that is often brought up is Deuteronomy 32, 8-9, which reads, "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of El, but Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage." So some scholars suggest this passage indicates the Most High, the god El, allotted the various nations to lesser gods to be ruled over, and when it came to Israel, El gave Yahweh this nation. And this indicates ancient Israel used to think El and Yahweh were two different gods, and Yahweh was subordinate to El. Furthermore, the grammar of this passage indicates the text is possibly ancient, and there are parallels to this idea in Ugaritic inscriptions, where El gives to other gods nations to rule over, such as Egypt. Now, the name El does show up in the Bible. In some places we read of El Elyon, meaning El Most High. But when we read of El, the authors indicate this is just another name for Yahweh. Karel van der Toorn lists several comparisons from the biblical text, speaking of Yahweh, to other ancient works that speak of El. And both are called Most High, and the Creator. El is called Father of Years, which is comparable to Yahweh, being called the Ancient of Days. El at times presides over a council, as does Yahweh. El is said to be compassionate, Yahweh is merciful and gracious. Both are described as shining, and both are referred to as the Holy One. Both are called Father, a healing god, appear in dreams, set amid cosmic waters, and are given the residency of a tent. It is often argued that originally Yahweh was much more like El than like Baal. In the patriarchal narratives of Genesis, El names such as El Olam and El Elyon are frequently used as epithets of Yahweh. Various scholars have drawn the conclusion that El and Yahweh were identified at a rather early stage. This identification is sometimes explained by assuming that Yahweh is originally an El figure. Meindert Dijkstra wrote extensively on the origin of the name Yahweh, and given the data, it most likely originally was just another name of El. He says, this revival of El's names and epithets in the exilic and post-exilic theological vocabulary is only explicable in the light of the tenuous, never-broken tradition that El Yahweh in the end is and was identical with the patriarchal El, the God of Israel. Mark Smith holds to the evolutionary theory and argues that by the 8th century, in Israel, Yahweh was given the female consort Asherah. The biblical authors condemn such practices as forsaking their ancient covenant. But Asherah was traditionally El's consort at Ugarit, so such an act would only make sense if there was a cultural idea that El and Yahweh were the same deity. So as far as the biblical authors were concerned, El Elyon was just another name for Yahweh. This would make sense with the name Israel. If El allotted Yahweh the people of Jacob, why was the nation not called Israel, being their national deity was Yahweh? But if Yahweh was just another name for El, this would make far more sense. Israel worshipped El, who was Yahweh. The case can also be made as well by looking at the text of Deuteronomy 32. First, the text doesn't say El allotted to Yahweh. It just says the Most High divided the nations. Elyon is just a title applied to many deities. It is applied to Yahweh in the biblical text, but at Ugarit, it is the title given to Baal. And interestingly enough, it is never applied there to El, the father of the gods. Since Elyon is probably just a title meaning Most High, it could just have been a title referring to Yahweh in Deuteronomy 32. Otto Eichfeld notes the language does not explicitly claim there is a distinction between Yahweh and the Most High. The author of the song, it is true when speaking of Yahweh's relationship to his people, avoids probably intentionally the application of the hitherto used active verbal form, and so does not say directly that Elyon gave Israel or Jacob to Yahweh as his portion, but is content to establish the fact that Israel has become the property of Yahweh. So the passage could just equally mean Yahweh, who is the Most High, gave up the nations to lesser deities and then created a people for himself. Even if the text did say El Elyon, that would not explicitly mean Yahweh was thought of as a different deity, since there are many other passages where they are identified as the same. To say they were originally seen as two separate deities is to presuppose the conclusion you're looking for. An explicit distinction may have been the case in different cultures, but that doesn't mean it was the case for the biblical authors. In fact, Mark Smith agrees. Despite possible appearances to the contrary, the composer did not intend any picture of polytheism with his rendering of verses 8 to 9. In fact, he likely thought of El and Elyon simply as two of Yahweh's titles, as they are elsewhere in the Bible, and not as a separate god El. The implied reference to the multiple divine sons likely did not bother the composer of the poem. In the wake of the identification of Elyon as a title of Yahweh, the divine sons are only implied in the text at best. It was probably easy for the composer to pay little or no attention to this matter, as this was a standard trope of divinity that the composer had inherited. Thus the passage shows something of an older worldview of translatability of the national gods, even as it ultimately rejects it. To see why, let's look at the internal context and the surrounding context of other biblical texts. Jonas Greenfield draws attention to the prior verses, where Yahweh is identified as Father, Creator, Wise, and has lived for the years of many generations. At Ugarit, these motifs and language are said of El. El is said to be the father and creator of mankind, as well as wise and the father of years. The language comes on the whole from the description of El. The people are called witless, that is, lacking the basic characteristic of El. The first and third verbs, create and establish, are used of El. Eternity, ages past, is a well-known word pair, but both words are epithets of El. Verse 8, which mentions the Most High and the sons of Adam, presents on the one hand another epithet of El, and on the other reminds us that El was called Father of Man. The author of Deuteronomy 32 has skillfully woven into his covenant poem these and other elements of antecedent literary traditions. Thus, Deuteronomy 32 applies the same language to Yahweh, implying the authors assumed they were one and the same. Now, some object to this by noting that in this passage, Yahweh is only said to be the father and creator of Israel, not all of mankind. Other lesser deities were said to be the fathers of their nations as well. However, this objection misses the point. The passage does just say Yahweh is the father of Israel here, but it is not just that title that scholars like Greenfield, Heiser, and van der Toorn draw on. It is the fact that the same motifs and language used of El is applied as a whole to Yahweh. If in this passage Yahweh was just called the father of Israel, no one would try to make the connections. But because several existing motifs of El are applied to Yahweh in Deuteronomy 32, it seems the authors already understood Yahweh was El. As for the passage only referencing Yahweh being the father of Israel, that would be expected because that is what the passage is about, not all of mankind. And despite that, the motifs are still there. Also, one of the biggest reasons I don't think Deuteronomy 32 implies Yahweh as a subordinate of El is we need to take a step back and look at the larger picture in two ways. First, let's remember where this text came from. In the much later Masoretic text, it doesn't read sons of El, but sons of Israel. Some scholars suggest this is a later attempt to hide polytheism by changing El to Israel. However, the reason we know it was not originally the sons of Israel is because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which came from an obviously monotheistic sect. If it is monotheists that copied and preserved this passage in question, we should be skeptical this passage was meant to imply polytheism. As for the Masoretic change, I'm not actually convinced this was an attempt to hide a polytheistic past. I think the change could reflect later Talmudic commentary that the Jews were meant to inherit the whole earth, and the Gentiles would become their slaves. The change would be consistent with this idea, because it would assume God had already divided the world up according to the 70 of Jacob, who went down to Egypt. So it doesn't necessarily refer to an attempt by the Masoretic scribes to hide polytheism. Also, several other passages within the biblical canon correlate to this monotheistic interpretation of Deuteronomy 32. Psalm 29, which is considered to be early by many scholars, says Yahweh is enthroned forever, over the flood. The text also begins with plural imperatives, indicating a divine counsel is at play. In the ancient Near East, the flood was thought to be over the dome that covered the earth, and if Yahweh is said to reign there, then he was already seen as ruler over all the nations that were beneath the flood. Psalm 24 is also considered by many to be an early psalm that refers to Yahweh as ruling over the world and is at the head of the divine council. The point being by bringing up these two psalms is to know there might be early evidence existing alongside Deuteronomy 32 that Yahweh was seen as already ruling the world, not just ruling Israel as an inheritance from El Elyon. Plus there is Numbers 23, another early poem attributed to Balaam, that also seems to equate El and Yahweh. Next, Nathan MacDonald notes a theme of Deuteronomy is how Yahweh chose or elected Israel. This would fit more with the interpretation that Yahweh the Most High gave other nations to lesser deities, but then elected Israel for himself instead of being given Israel. Also, a later text incorporated into Deuteronomy is chapter 4, which parallels Deuteronomy 32, and says it was Yahweh who allotted the nations to other Elohim and kept Israel for himself. Another later text, like Isaiah 10:13, has Yahweh in control of the boundaries of the nations. These are often dismissed as coming from a later monotheistic time period, but as we mentioned, The language and grammar shows that some of these passages are early as well, and provides surrounding context to better explain the theology of Deuteronomy 32. Plus, internally speaking, Deuteronomy 32 can function just fine as monotheistic, as the Essenes probably thought. So the larger context seems to fit more with this monotheistic understanding, as does the internal evidence. If the only reply after this is brought up is monotheism was a late development, so there has to be evidence of early polytheism, then you're just assuming the conclusion you want and not letting the evidence speak for itself. Some try to argue that later in Deuteronomy 32, Yahweh is seen as an accuser, and this would signify he is not the Most High. In Zechariah 3, Yahweh is judge, and a lesser being acts as a Satan, meaning accuser in Hebrew. Well, it is true Yahweh acts as an accuser of Israel, but in verses 19 to 29, he also acts as judge, which was the role of the one who presides over the council. Verse 19 notes that Yahweh sees the crime, and then what follows is he passes judgment. Yahweh will make them jealous, provoke them to anger, and bring about all sorts of disasters. There is not a shift to another deity above Yahweh. In Zechariah 3, Yahweh passes judgment through the angel of the Lord, who is also said to be Yahweh. So Yahweh taking on two roles in Deuteronomy 32 would not be an issue for the biblical text. This is then followed by Yahweh implying he is the Most High, because there are none beside him, and he has the power over life and death. And then there is another claim that Yahweh is at the head of the divine council, and that the gods should bow down to him. This seems to be pretty clear language that Yahweh was already seen as El within the poem itself. Again, Mark Smith agrees. More specifically, the original composer understood El Elyon as a title for Yahweh, despite drawing on the old polytheistic type element. The author intended no polytheism, and perhaps knew none in this case. In other words, the biblical authors may be referencing an old polytheistic idea of El dividing the nations, but they still understand this as if El was just another name for Yahweh, and interpreted this within their own monotheistic framework. And there is no issue in acknowledging they reference this old idea. After all, the biblical authors readily admit they descended from polytheists. But that doesn't mean biblical theology evolved from polytheism, since this is consistent with the biblical account of a sudden change due to divine revelation. This would be similar to what Paul does in Acts 17, taking old polytheistic poems from Greek writers and applying them to Yahweh. Taking something from a polytheist and reinterpreting it doesn't necessarily mean biblical theology evolved. The last objection is in verse 9, where the conjunction could indicate a contrast. In other words, the use of the word should be understood as a shift from the Most High to Yahweh, who receives his inheritance. Well, this is possible, but unlikely given the immediate context we already went over. The passage can equally just refer to the Most High dividing the rebellious nations up and then creating a people of his own. Ultimately, the cultural context can be helpful in shedding light on a particular passage, but it should never be used to trump the immediate context of the passage in question. And when it comes to the biblical text, the immediate context overwhelmingly implies Yahweh was understood as another name for El, not a lesser deity under El. The other passage that is brought up is Psalm 82, a psalm of someone named Asaph, which reads, "God has taken his place in the council of El. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die, and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations." So scholars like Mark Smith and Simon Parker draw on the verbs for to stand and to judge. In the ancient divine council setting, the judge would sit, whereas the members of the council would stand. If Yahweh is standing, he is not at the head of the council, but just a member among many other Elohim. Also, the verb for the word to judge can also mean to charge or accuse. As we noted earlier, being the accuser is often the job of a lesser being, not the judge residing over the council. So it appears Yahweh is just an accuser standing before the council of the Most High. However, like with Deuteronomy 32, this seems to be quote mining. At the end of the psalm, it is Yahweh who pronounces judgment. There is no indication of a shift in speaker, despite the claim by some that the author silently switched from Yahweh to El, speaking in verse 6. There is no hint that this is what is happening. Also, generic terminology is used like Elohim and Elyon. Considering the author is just using titles, we have to acknowledge there is no explicit mention of a separation of Yahweh and El, just like it is with the rest of Scripture. The terms could just as easily be understood to be referring to Yahweh, who was the Elyon, Most High. Because of this, it is far more parsimonious to understand Psalm 82 as giving Yahweh the role of accuser and judge, and this makes sense with the context. The other Elohim have failed to do their jobs properly, and cannot be trusted with divine roles. Yahweh thus takes on the roles of judge and accuser, since there is no other Elohim who can properly perform such tasks. As Kirsten Nielsen said, "It would appear from our brief survey of recent research, as well as the textual analyses we have here performed, that it is characteristic of the prophetic lawsuit that Yahweh enjoys the dual role of prosecutor and judge. That Yahweh appears as prosecutor can be explained by the fact that it is he who has been wronged. So it makes sense for Yahweh to stand and accuse in the beginning. None of the other Elohim have carried out their roles properly, so none of them can be trusted, and Yahweh takes on the role of accuser and judge to add insult to injury." Some object that the Hebrew phrase "in the midst" refers to Yahweh being equal to other Elohim. Being in the midst of others implies an idea of equal power, but this is not the case elsewhere. For example, Numbers 14:14 says Yahweh is in the midst of his people, and that obviously doesn't mean Yahweh is equal to humans. Next, this interpretation of the passage would correlate to other places where Yahweh takes on two roles. Throughout the biblical text, Yahweh tends to act through a co-regent, seen as an extension of himself, and at times is also referred to as Yahweh. In Zechariah 3, Yahweh acts as judge, but also is a mouthpiece for the judge as a separate figure known as the angel of Yahweh. This would be similar to Psalm 82, where Yahweh takes on two roles. Trygve Medinger notes in the biblical text, the name of Yahweh was seen as an independent yet extension of Yahweh himself. And there are other passages where we see an extension of Yahweh acting as a co-regent with Yahweh who sent him. So given the context of the Hebrew scriptures, that is all that is probably taking place in this brief psalm. Yahweh is taking on two roles by an extension of himself. As Michael Heiser says, the burden of proof falls to Smith, Parker, and other scholars to detect any expression in the Hebrew Bible that demonstrates Yahweh lacked jurisdiction over any part of the earth at any time in Israelite religion. Also, what is so inconceivable about the idea of ancient monolatry or monotheistic ideas? Why does this have to be a late development in Israel, and therefore all the clearly monotheistic ideas must be dated to later periods? This is something I have never understood. It is not like the ancient Near East was devoid of monolatry or henotheistic tendencies. A text from the Old Babylonian Empire reads, "Lord Nana, who is greater than you? With whom can you be compared?" A Neo-Assyrian text reads, "Whoever comes after me, trust in the god Nebu, trust no other god." In Egypt, one of the Hyksos kings was said to worship no other god but Seth, and the Hyksos were originally from Canaan. Jan Asman highlights Egyptian wisdom literature as being quite henotheistic, with only focusing on the Creator being the only God that matters when it comes to the idea that all of the other gods in life were dependent on the Creator God Ra. Then, of course, we cannot forget the heretic king Akhenaten, who attempted to impose monotheism on Egypt. After his demise, monotheistic tendencies remained in different texts, referencing ideas that all the gods were just different aspects of one supreme god. Osman says, in Egypt, this concept of a supreme being comprising in his essence the whole pantheon goes back to the Ramesside period, and seems to be a reaction to Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution. It stresses the oneness of God while retaining the multiplicity of the divine. In the last instance, all gods are but one, the immanent manifold manifestation and diversification of a hidden and transcendent unity. So why is it so inconceivable that there was an ancient Amorite named Abram from the Middle Bronze Age who had monolathrist ideas about his personal god Yahweh, who he identified with the high god El Elyon, which was then forgotten by his descendants and later revived under someone named Moses? Why is this so inconceivable in the existence of monolatry with monotheistic tendencies in the ancient Near East so unfathomable? Thus, given all this data, the claim that biblical texts were originally polytheistic should be rejected. Until we have external evidence, there is no reason to posit this idea. When it comes to the Hebrew Bible, we are dealing with a monotheistic canon. The debate should be about when these documents were written. Were some put together early and the rest accurately reflect the past? Or were they all written late and reflect late religious ideas? But the claim that the biblical texts were edited later to remove ancient polytheism is based on very limited data. The few passages brought up by skeptics make far more sense within their own context, the Hebrew Bible.